Hello everyone. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video about our experimental program here at the University of Maryland, where we're interested in probing quantum dynamics under extreme conditions. We are interested in three conditions. The first is ultra-fast, where we're interested in watching atoms and electrons migrate in molecules. The second condition is ultra-intense, where we're interested in using petawatt lasers to look at vacuum fluctuation. That is, the very nature of the vacuum itself. Finally, we're interested in ultra-cold atoms, where we want to use them as simulators to study fundamental quantum behavior. Because this is an experimental program, let me take a few moments to tell you a little bit about how we generate ultrashort pulses. The process starts with an oscillator, which generates a pulse that has a lot of bandwidth, that is, many colors. This allows us to generate pulses anywhere from about 5 femtoseconds out to maybe 100 femtoseconds or longer. We're interested in the shorter femtosecond pulses, however. These pulses themselves are not very intense. In order to do the experiments of interest, we need to amplify them. We do that by using a trick called chirped-pulse amplification. This allows us to reach very high energies and thus high intensities without damaging any of the optics in the laser itself. The pulse that results is what's known as a transform-limited pulse, which can be used directly. However, for part of our experiments, we're interested in what's known as pulse shaping. Pulse shaping allows us to move some of the colors around so that the red components arrive at a different time from the blue components and so forth. And by shaping these pulses, we can actually make molecules do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. Typically, it's very difficult to a priori predict what type of pulse we actually need. So we use a trick of machine learning via genetic algorithm. As an example, let me tell you about an experiment we did in CO2, where we were interested in trying to enhance the bending amplitude during dissociative ionization. The experiment was to compare the response from a transform-limited pulse to a shaped pulse. The shaped pulse, given by our genetic algorithm, is shown here on the left. As you can see, the shaped pulse consists of a series of pulses, small at the beginning, followed by a very large pulse. And here is the response. The alpha response, corresponding to the transform-limited pulse, has a very relatively narrow pulse compared to the beta response to the shaped pulse. Now the interpretation is that the very small pulses at the beginning initiate bending in the molecule, while the very large pulse ionizes the system at its peak bending. And this is the response that we get. Now, as I mentioned, we want to look at what happens when electrons move around. Since electrons are much lighter, we need much shorter pulses. Well, shorter pulses correspond to shorter wavelengths. It's easy to see that here in the Ti sapphire at 800 nanometers, which we used in the previous experiment. It has a single cycle time of about 2.67 femtoseconds, meaning that we cannot get a pulse any shorter than that. On the other hand, if we wanted a 100 attosecond pulse, then we're going to need a wavelength of about 30 nanometers. Now, so how do we generate such short pulses? Well, we use a trick called high harmonic generation. High harmonic generation consists of focusing a drive laser into a noble gas, something like xenon or argon. The drive laser then ionizes the gas, liberating electrons. These electrons then get trapped in the laser field. The electric field then accelerates these electrons. Because the electric field keeps oscillating back and forth, the electrons come back and revisits the ion from which it came. Occasionally, some of these electrons then recombine with those ions and then give off radiation. The upper right panel shows this radiation, and we can see that we can get out beyond 75 eV. In fact, we can go much longer, to much higher energies than that as well. So this is a process that is generally helpful for generating these XUV photons. Now, what are we going to do with these photons? Well, the real beauty for using these photons is that we can look at time-dependent processes. And here is a way to do that using a technique called transient absorption. The IR photons are used to generate the XUV, as we showed on the previous slide, in GC1. These photons, XUV photons, are then directed through a mirror where we combine the XUV and the IR photons together and then send them through GC2. The XUV then is being absorbed by the sample in GC1, an atom or a molecule. The XUV then causes the atoms to be perturbed by interacting with the valence electron. And then finally, we have a spectrometer which only looks at the XUV because the IR is filtered out in F2. On the right is a picture of the apparatus, and on the left are two investigators standing in front of one of the cells and the spectrometer. Here's a picture of the sample of the transient absorption signal that we see in argon. It consists of three parts. On the left, we have the XUV, which you can get before you introduce the IR. On the IR, we have the signal of just the IR by itself. And in the middle, we have the overlap between the XUV and the IR. Now, on the left-hand side, the XUV absorption is well known. It's been known for a long time, and we can see that in the right-hand side of this panel. And the XUV panel overlaps those same peaks, so we can see the same type of transition. What's interesting is the transient part in the middle. The IR now interacts only with the valence electrons. And even though it's only interacting with the valence electrons, it causes perturbation to the deeply buried inner shell electrons. And that becomes a really nice technique for looking at what happens as you move electrons around in a molecule. For example, in CH4, it's well known that if you remove one of the electrons, you ionize a valence electron, which you can do with the IR pulse. Then the shape of the molecule changes from this tetrahedral to a plane. And that's what we want to look at because it's never been observed directly before because the shape change is very, very fast. And we are setting up to do that right now. Now I've just given you a sample of two of the experiments that we've done at the ultra-fast regime. So let me just end by telling you what we're doing in the ultra-intense and in the ultra-cold regime. In the ultra-intense regime, as I mentioned earlier, that the very high intensities, we're able to actually look at what the vacuum itself does. Now let's back up a little bit because Maxwell tells us that the interaction between photons is null. That is, that Maxwell's equations basically are linear. So photons don't interact with themselves. Light passes through, and that's why we have each other, and that's why we have the principle of superposition. But quantum electrodynamics, which goes beyond Maxwell, tells us that we should have higher order terms. And these nonlinear terms now lead to a nonlinear behavior between photons. And in fact, at 10 to the 25, we should be in a regime where if we were to scatter two photons together, now we should be sensitive to this vacuum fluctuation, that is the electron and positron pairs which interact, which come into existence and out of existence very fast. And this is what we're setting up to try to see. Now, you can see from the QED expression that there are two nonlinear terms, one with the subscript L, which we call the longitudinal term, and one with the subscript T, which we call the transverse term. What that means is that when the vacuum is birefringent, by birefringent we mean that if we were to scatter two photons with parallel um, polarization, we would get a different answer than if we scattered two photons that have perpendicular polarization. And this is what we're setting up to try to see right now. This is a very hard experiment, and we don't yet have lasers that can get this intense, but we expect that these lasers will be available within the next 3 to 5 years as they're being built at the moment. The other set of experiments that we're interested in doing is using BEC as a simulator, and the process that we want to look at is a very straightforward fundamental process, and that is the process of tunneling. Tunneling turns out to be a little bit controversial as to how long does it take for a quantum particle to actually tunnel through a barrier, and what happens to that to the wave packet underneath the barrier. Both of these can be studied with a Bose-Einstein condensate, where we can create the Bose-Einstein condensate and we can let it travel through a channel with and without a barrier. The condensate now gives us a way to very slow down the process so we can actually take a look to see what's going on. And then we hope to relate that back to tunneling processes with electrons, which happens all the time in electronics, or even atoms tunneling out of barriers in molecules. So at the moment, we're doing numerical simulations of this so that we can determine how to set up the experiment. Now, in my group, we tend to like to work in collaborations. We collaborate with people on campus, we collaborate with people off campus, and we collaborate internationally as well. We collaborate with other experimentalists, we collaborate with theorists, and here are some of the people who worked on some of the things that I told you about in terms of the ultra-fast experiment. In terms of the ultra-intense experiment, these experiments are generally being done in Europe, and so my students go over and spend time in Europe on these machines. And here's a group of investigators. The people from my group who were involved in this are the last four individuals at the top, and they interact again internationally, and we have Skype calls weekly to go over the data that we have. And as I mentioned, we also interact with people here at JQI, the Cold Atom, so it's a really interactive group, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen and to watch this video. And if you have any questions, you can get my contact information off the first slide. So thank you very much.